I was evicted from the $18,500 holiday chalet that I funded because my own family deemed me unworthy of their status. They expected me to vanish in humiliation. They were wrong. A single click on my audit folder tonight will incinerate their entire empire of lies. Welcome to the collapse of the Greenwich elite. The city of New York does not just demand your time, it demands your soul. I have spent the last 6 years navigating the glass canyons of Manhattan, building a life from nothing but ambition and 18-hour workdays. My apartment in the financial district overlooks the East River, a view that most people would consider a sign that I have made it. However, every time the sun sets over the water, I'm reminded that my success is a solitary island. I have climbed the ladder, but I have done so without a hand from the people who were supposed to provide the foundation. In the world of my father, Preston, and my mother, Lucille, success is not measured by how hard you work, but by how well you perform. They live in Greenwich, Connecticut, in a house where the lawns are manicured with surgical precision and the silence in the hallways is louder than any argument. In Greenwich, image is the only currency that matters. My sister, Caitlin, learned this early. She turned her life into a digital gallery, a curated series of moments designed to incite envy rather than connection. I was always the outlier, the one who preferred the messy reality of a startup to the polished boredom of the country club. I thought this Christmas would be different. I wanted to believe that the distance between my life in New York City and their life in Greenwich could be bridged by a single grand gesture. I spent weeks searching for something that would finally make them see me not as the disappointing son who walked away from the family firm, but as a man who could provide for them. I found it in a listing for a chalet in Lake Tahoe. It was a masterpiece of stone and timber perched on a ridge overlooking the sapphire waters of the lake. The photographs showed floor-to-ceiling glass walls that blurred the line between the warmth of the hearth and the frozen beauty of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The price was $18,500 for the week of Christmas. It was a staggering amount of money, even for someone with my salary, but I did not hesitate. I viewed it as an investment in a version of my family that did not yet exist. I believed that if I could place us all in a setting that was beautiful enough, the ugliness between us would simply dissolve. I met my father for a brief lunch at a steakhouse in Midtown to tell him the news. Preston sat across from me, the overhead lights catching the polished surface of his Rolex GMT Master II. That watch was a trophy, a shining circle of gold and steel that screamed of heritage and unearned confidence. He adjusted his cuff frequently, making sure the waiter and the surrounding tables noticed the weight on his wrist. I looked down at my own watch. It was a rugged, stainless steel piece I had bought with my first significant bonus. It was scratched at the edges and the leather strap was worn from years of daily use. To my father, my watch was a utility, a tool for a common laborer. To him, his Rolex was an identity. He did not ask how my business was doing or if I was happy. He only looked at my wrist with a faint patronizing smile as if my choice of timepiece confirmed every doubt he had ever held about my potential. "I have booked a place for the holidays," I said, sliding the printed confirmation across the table. "Lake Tahoe. The entire family. I have already paid the $18,500 in full." For a split second, the mask slipped. His eyes widened as he processed the number. He saw the paid stamp on the invoice and the luxury branding of the estate. I felt a surge of hope, a desperate, childish heat in my chest. I thought that this was the moment he would finally say he was proud of me. I thought he would recognize that I had built something substantial enough to treat the entire family to a luxury that even his current accounts were struggling to maintain. "It is a start," he said, his voice returning to that cold, measured tone he used for business negotiations. "It is a suitable location for the guests I might invite. You should send the access codes to your mother. She will need to handle the logistics. You tend to overlook the details, Xavier." He did not say thank you. He did not acknowledge the sacrifice. He simply reached out and took the paper, reclaiming the narrative before I could even finish my sentence. He treated my gesture like a late tax payment rather than a gift of love. Despite the coldness of his reaction, I walked back to my office through the winter air of New York City, feeling a strange sense of optimism. I told myself that his stoicism was just a habit of his generation. I imagined my mother Lucille softening when she saw the mountain views. I imagined Caitlin putting down her phone to actually speak to me by the fire. I was $18,500 poorer, but I felt wealthy with the possibility of reconciliation. I wanted to belong so badly that I ignored the way my father had folded the receipt and tucked it into his pocket as if it had his name on it. I did not realize then that I was not buying a seat at the table. I was merely paying for the stage on which they would eventually betray me. The digital erasure began 3 days later with a notification that arrived while I was riding the subway back to my apartment. The screen of my phone illuminated with a message from my mother, Lucille. Her communication style was always a masterclass in passive aggression, wrapped in the soft silk of maternal concern. She did not start with a greeting or an inquiry about my well-being. Instead, she moved directly toward the administrative realignment of reality. "Savior, darling," the message read. "I was looking at the Lake Tahoe reservation details you shared. Your father mentioned that it would be so much more seamless for the EHE property host and on-site staff. These luxury mountain rentals can be surprisingly traditional. It would avoid any confusion during check-in if the patriarch's name was the one on the ledger. It is just a formality, of course." I sat in the flickering light of the train car, the words blurring as the car jolted over the tracks. It was not just a formality, it was the first stroke of a digital eraser. By moving my name to the secondary contact field, they were effectively removing the evidence of my ownership. In the eyes of the hosting company and the world, I would become a guest at my own event. I did not reply immediately. Experience had taught me that in the Greenwich household, a question was never a question. It was a directive disguised as a suggestion. When I reached my apartment and opened my laptop, I saw that the campaign was already multi-platform. Caitlin had been busy. I navigated to her social media profile and watched a series of high-definition stories that had been posted over the last 6 hours. She had created a mood board of the Lake Tahoe Chalet, layering photographs of the stone fireplace and the snow-covered deck with upbeat music. The caption on the final slide was a jagged blade to my chest. "Counting down the days until our mountain escape. So incredibly grateful to have a father who works so hard to provide these moments for us. Preston is truly the best. Family is everything." She had tagged our father and several of her high-profile friends, but my name was nowhere to be found. The comments were already flooding in, filled with heart emojis and praises for my father's generosity. My sister was not just sharing a vacation, she was constructing a brand. She was selling a narrative of a perfect, wealthy family led by a benevolent patriarch, and I was being edited out of the frame like a technical error. I looked at the confirmation email for the $18,500. I looked at the bank transfer timestamp. The objective truth sat in my inbox, yet the public truth was being rewritten in real time. For a moment, the familiar heat of indignation rose in my throat. I wanted to call the group chat and demand a correction. I wanted to scream that I was the one who had sacrificed my sleep and my savings to make this happen, but then a different instinct took over the one that had allowed me to survive and thrive in the competitive landscape of New York City. I realized that in a world of performance, documentation is the only defense. I would not argue. I would not plead. I would simply log the truth. I created a new directory on my encrypted cloud drive. I named it Tahoe Audit. I began the process with clinical precision. I did not just take screenshots. I captured the full metadata of every communication. I saved Lucille's message as a PDF, ensuring the header information and the exact timestamp were preserved. I exported the original Airbnb booking confirmation, including the unique transaction ID and the logging data from the initial payment. I then turned my attention to Caitlin's social media posts. I used a screen recording tool to capture her stories, scrolling through the comments to show the public misattribution of the payment. I saved the source code of the web pages where she had tagged our father. I was building a chronological record of the betrayal, a digital paper trail that mapped the exact moment the lie began. I opened a spreadsheet within the Tahoe audit folder and created columns for date, platform sender, and the content summary. I logged the message from Lucille regarding the primary contact change. I logged the unauthorized attempt by my father's office to call the rental agency, a notification I had received from the host earlier that afternoon. Every piece of data was a sandbag against the flood of their manipulation. This was no longer about a vacation. It was about the integrity of my own life. If I allowed them to rewrite the history of this one transaction, I was giving them permission to rewrite the history of me. I sat in the blue light of my monitors, my fingers moving across the keyboard with a cold, steady rhythm. The folder grew with every click. Screenshots, JSON files of the messaging logs, and archived versions of the social media threads were all meticulously organized. I felt a strange sense of calm as the Tahoe audit folder populated. The emotional weight of their silence and their smirks was being converted into hard, undeniable data. They thought they were playing a game of social standing and aesthetic perfection. They did not realize that I was conducting a forensic analysis of their dishonesty. As I closed my laptop for the night, the silence of my apartment felt different. It was no longer the silence of the excluded. It was the silence of the prepared. I had the receipts, I had the timestamps, I had the truth stored in a place where their cards and their cardigans could not reach it. I lay in the dark, watching the city lights pulse against my ceiling, knowing that the ledger was balanced even if they did not know it yet. The Tahoe audit was open, and the first entry was their own greed. The drive from New York City to Greenwich is a short distance that covers a vast emotional divide. In Manhattan, life is defined by what you build. In Greenwich, life is defined by what you curate. As I drove through the wrought iron gates of the family estate, the white gravel crunched under my tires with a sound that felt like an intrusion. The house stood as a monument to a legacy I had tried to bridge with an $18,500 gesture. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive balsam and the hollow silence of a museum. I walked into the kitchen hoping for a flicker of genuine welcome. My mother, Lucille, stood by the marble island, her appearance as polished and impenetrable as a diamond. She offered a smile that was practiced and distant, the kind of expression she reserved for social acquaintances she was obligated to tolerate. "Xavier, you have arrived," she said, her voice a soft melodic hum that carried no warmth. "We were not certain when your schedule would permit you to leave the city. You always seem so consumed by your work." She did not move to embrace me. Instead, she turned her attention to the center of the dining table. A large cerise red Le Creuset cast-iron pot sat prominently on a trivet, its vibrant color demanding attention. It was a masterpiece of French engineering, a symbol of domestic warmth and a home-cooked meal. It looked as though it should be filled with a rich, simmering stew that had been prepared with care. I had skipped lunch to make the trip, and the sight of the pot triggered a primitive sense of hope. I reached out to lift the heavy lid, expecting the steam and the aroma of home to greet me. The iron was cold. When I moved the lid aside, the interior of the pot was bone-dry and empty. There was no food, no warmth, and no intention of a meal. It was a prop placed there to serve as a visual anchor for the holiday cards Caitlin was currently staging in the next room. It was the perfect metaphor for my mother's affection. An expensive, flawless vessel containing absolutely nothing. "We are dining at the country club with the Millers later," Lucille said dismissively, noting my silence. "The pot was simply for the aesthetic. It makes the room feel more inviting for the photographs, do you not think?" I replaced the lid with a hollow thud. The sound echoed through the sterile kitchen. Caitlin walked in, then her eyes fixed on her phone. She did not look up to acknowledge my presence. "Move your keys, Xavier," she muttered. "They are casting a shadow on the sideboard. I'm trying to finish the Christmas Eve preview for my followers." I moved my keys. I moved my bag. I moved myself into the shadow of the hallway, realizing that I was a guest who had stayed too long before the event had even begun. The evening reached its breaking point when my father Preston entered the room. He carried an aura of unshakable authority, his Rolex GMT Master 2 catching the light as he poured a drink. He did not look at me directly. He spoke to the air in front of him, though the message was intended to dismantle my entire contribution. Xavier, he began, his voice dropping into the cold transactional tone he used for board meetings. We have been reviewing the logistics for the Lake Tahoe Chalet. I have spent the afternoon speaking with some of my senior partners. It turns out they will be in the region during the holiday week. I felt a sharp, icy sensation settle in my chest. And how does that affect the reservation I paid for Father? Preston finally turned to look at me, his gaze as hard as flint. It affects everything. These are men who hold the keys to our family's future standing. They require a level of privacy and exclusivity that a crowded house cannot provide. We have decided it is for the best if you remain in New York City this Christmas. You have your own responsibilities there after all. It is a busy season for your firm. I stood frozen in the amber glow of the kitchen. You are telling me that I am not welcome at the holiday I funded. You are excluding me from my own reservation, so you can entertain your business associates. Do not be dramatic, Lucille added from the doorway, her voice like a silk shroud. It is a matter of strategic hospitality. Your father is thinking of the long-term benefit for the family name. We can always schedule a brief lunch in January. It is not as if you cannot afford to treat yourself to a nice meal in the city. The resentment I had suppressed for years finally transformed into a crystalline clarity. I looked at the empty Le Creuset on the table. I looked at Caitlin, who was already editing a photo of the mantel, completely indifferent to my exclusion. I looked at my father, who saw me as nothing more than a logistical inconvenience in his pursuit of status. The realization was a shock to my system. My mistake was not in being a disappointing son. My mistake was in believing that my money or my success could buy a seat at a table where I was never truly a member. I was not a part of their family. I was a sponsor of their lifestyle, and a sponsor has the power to withdraw his support. I understand perfectly, I said. My voice was quiet, stripped of the desperation that had defined our relationship for a decade. I will get out of your way. I walked out of the house and back to my car without another word. I did not take the gifts I had brought. I did not say goodbye. As I drove away from Greenwich, leaving the manicured lawns and the hollow lights behind the Tahoe audit folder in my mind felt like a loaded weapon. They had provided the final undeniable piece of evidence. They did not want my presence. They only wanted my resources. As the skyline of New York City appeared on the horizon, glowing with a real, unfiltered energy, I reached for my phone. It was time to stop being a ghost in their story and start being the owner of my own. The drive back to New York City along Interstate 95 was a blur of sodium lights and cold adrenaline. By the time I crossed the bridge into Manhattan, the resentment had solidified into a professional detachment. I was no longer a grieving son. I was a man closing a bad deal. I reached my apartment, the silence of the city night pressing against my windows, and sat at my desk. The glowing screens of my monitors felt like the only honest things left in my life. I opened the Airbnb dashboard. The $18,500 reservation for the Lake Tahoe Chalet stared back at me. I moved the cursor over the cancellation button. The policy was clear because I was the primary account holder and the cancellation was occurring within the refundable window. The entire sum would be returned to my account within 3 to 5 business days. I clicked. The confirmation appeared instantly, a digital guillotine dropping on the family's holiday plans. However, as I was closing the browser, an alert chime echoed from my phone. It was a high-priority notification from my bank's fraud department. The message stated that an unusual transaction had been attempted on a secondary credit card account, a card I had issued to my parents years ago for genuine emergencies, one I had neglected to deactivate. I logged into my financial portal and felt a surge of cold fury. There was a pending authorization for $5,200 from a private aviation company in Lake Tahoe. The memo line in the metadata was explicit. Private helicopter tour for Preston and guests. My father had not only kicked me out of the holiday I funded, He was actively attempting to use my remaining credit line to entertain the business partners he had prioritized over me. He assumed that my silence in Greenwich was a sign of submission. He believed that I would continue to serve as the invisible bank for his social performances. In the United States, the financial system is built on a delicate architecture of trust and documentation. When a transaction is marked as unauthorized, it triggers a cascade of protocols designed to protect the integrity of the account holder. I picked up the phone and dialed the bank's 24-hour fraud line. When the representative answered, I did not explain the family dynamics. I did not mention that the perpetrator was my father. I spoke the language of the system. I stated that an unauthorized user was attempting to access my credit line for a luxury purchase. I provided the specific transaction ID and confirmed that I did not authorize the aviation company to process the charge. I would like to report this as an instance of financial fraud and identity misappropriation. I said, my voice steady. I want to initiate a full investigation and trigger a fraud alert across all bureaus. By using these specific terms, I was activating a powerful mechanism. Once a report of fraud is filed, the bank is legally obligated under the Fair Credit Reporting Act to take immediate action. They did not just decline the $5,000 charge, they initiated a hard freeze on the account. Because my father's name was linked as a secondary user on that specific line, the system triggered internal reviews and raised red flags across several of his active credit relationships. In the American credit system, your credit score is your reputation in numeric form. By reporting the transaction as fraud, I was causing a massive negative impact on his credit profile. A fraud flag of this magnitude would stop any pending loan applications, trigger reviews of his existing business lines, and jeopardize his pending credit lines, and complicate any ongoing financing discussions. For a man like Preston, who relied on leverage and high-limit credit to maintain his Greenwich lifestyle, this was a catastrophic blow. I watched the confirmation of the fraud report appear in my inbox. The bank had locked the card and started the recovery process. I then went a step further. I contacted the credit bureaus Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion and placed an extended fraud alert on my file which would effectively sever any shared financial history I had with the Greenwich estate. I leaned back in my chair, the Tahoe audit folder now containing the final lethal pieces of evidence, the attempted unauthorized charge, and the official fraud report number. Preston had wanted the holiday to be about status and business partners. He was about to find out that without my credit line, his status was as empty as the Le Creuset pot on my mother's table. He had tried to steal my name to bolster his own. Now his name was a red flag in the very system he worshipped. I closed the laptop and looked out at the city. The game had moved from the living room to the ledger, and in that arena I was the one with the power. The silence that followed the cancellation was the most honest communication I had received from my family in years. For 48 hours, my phone was a graveyard of ignored calls and frantic text messages. The digital guillotine had fallen, and the shockwaves were reverberating through the halls of the Greenwich estate. Finally, a message arrived from my mother that differed from her usual passive-aggressive tone. It was short and lacked the usual decorative emojis. Xavier, we are all devastated by this misunderstanding. Your father is unwell with stress. Please come for dinner on Thursday. We must reconcile for the sake of the family. We will make this right. I knew it was a trap, but it was a trap I was prepared to walk into. I was no longer seeking a seat at their table. I was seeking a confession for my records. When I arrived at the Greenwich house on Thursday evening, I did not enter as a son looking for approval. I entered as a technician. Before I stepped out of my car, I activated a high-fidelity voice recording application on my phone, which was tucked securely in my breast pocket. I also initiated a remote sync to my Tahoe audit folder, ensuring that every second of audio would be uploaded to the cloud in real time. If they attempted to seize my device, the evidence would already be safe in New York City. The atmosphere inside the house was frantic. Gone was the curated peace of the previous week. Lucille was pale, her movements jittery as she poured wine with a shaking hand. Preston sat at the head of the table, but the aura of the powerful patriarch had vanished. He looked diminished, his face etched with a desperate gray fatigue that even the expensive lighting could not hide. Caitlin sat in the corner, her phone abandoned on the sideboard, a sign that the situation was too dire even for her social media feed. "Thank you for coming, Xavier," Lucille whispered as she placed a plate of salmon in front of me. This time the food was real, but I did not touch it. I sat in silence watching them. I was cold, calculated, and entirely detached from their performance. "We need you to reinstate the reservation immediately," Preston said, skipping the pleasantries. His voice lacked its usual resonance. It was thin and brittle. "I will reimburse you for the inconvenience. I will add $5,000 to the total. But that chalet must be back in our name by tomorrow morning." "Why?" I asked. My voice was a flat line in the room. "You told me I was not welcome. You told me to stay in the city. Why is this specific property so important to you now?" Preston slammed his hand on the table, but the gesture felt like a hollow reflex. "Because it is about more than a vacation, you fool. Do you have any idea what is happening to the firm? The Millers and the other partners are not just coming for a holiday. They are coming to inspect the strength of my position." The recording picked up every word as the truth began to pour out like water from a burst pipe. Over the next 20 minutes, the facade of Greenwich perfection disintegrated. Preston was not just stressed, he was drowning. He had overleveraged the family estate to fund a series of failed commercial real estate ventures. He was millions of dollars in debt, and the partners he was so eager to entertain were actually creditors who were deciding whether to pull the plug on his remaining credit lines. "They think I am still the man who can afford an $18,000 chalet for his family without blinking," Preston hissed, laying across the table. His eyes were bloodshot. The chalet was the proof of my liquidity. It was the stage I needed to secure the bridge loan that will save this house. If they find out the reservation was canceled, if they find out my son is the one with the capital and I am the one with the fraud alert on my record, it is over. Everything is over. I looked at my mother. She was staring at her wine glass, her silence a confirmation of the rot. She had known about the debt. She had been a willing accomplice in trying to use my success to mask their bankruptcy. They did not just want to exclude me. They needed to erase me so they could use my resources as a camouflage for their failure. "You were going to use my money to lie to your partners so you could borrow more money you cannot pay back," I said, the words falling like stones into a dark well. "And you were going to kick me out of the house I paid for because my presence would remind them that you are no longer the provider." "It was for the family," Lucille cried out, finally looking up. "If the house goes, we all go. We were doing this to protect the legacy." "There is no legacy," I replied, standing up. My chair scraped against the hardwood floor with a final decisive sound. "There is only a ledger that does not balance. And I am not a line of credit for your lies." I felt a profound sense of decisiveness. The Tahoe audit was now complete. I had the confirmation of the original payment, the record of the digital erasure, the fraud report for the helicopter tour, and now the audio confession of the financial desperation that drove their betrayal. They had tried to turn me into a ghost, but they had succeeded only in turning me into a witness. I walked out of the dining room while Preston was still shouting about loyalty and Lucille was sobbing into her linen napkin. I did not look back. As I drove toward the gates of Greenwich for the final time, I checked my phone. The upload was complete. The truth was secure. The storm was coming for them, and for the first time in my life, I was not the one standing in the rain. Preston had managed to scramble together a desperate alternative to the estate I had canceled. It was a rental on the far outskirts of South Lake Tahoe, a dated A-frame cabin that smelled of damp pine and old upholstery. It was a far cry from the $18,500 sanctuary I had originally funded. The Millers and the other business partners were there, their expensive wool coats looking entirely out of place against the worn shag carpet of the living room. The tension in the air was palpable. The performance of Greenwich luxury was failing in the face of this mediocre reality. I stood near the back of the room, a silent observer in the shadows of the wooden rafters. I watched my father Preston attempting to exert his usual charm. He was holding a bottle of sparkling wine that he was pretending was a vintage, his voice booming with a forced heartiness that did not quite mask the tremor in his hands. My mother, Lucille, moved through the cramped space with a brittle smile, trying to maintain the illusion of hospitality, while the partners exchanged skeptical glances. I was about to leave when Aunt Tabitha approached me. She had always been the quietest member of the family, a woman who lived on the periphery of the Greenwich social circle and observed everything with a cold, analytical eye. She did not offer a greeting. Instead, she leaned in close, her voice a low murmur that carried the weight of a decade of secrets. "He did not just use your credit line, Xavier," she said, her eyes fixed on Preston across the room. She reached into her handbag and pressed a small, encrypted flash drive into my palm. "I have been the one managing the secondary accounts for the family trust for 20 years. I have watched him bleed you dry while he told you that you were a disappointment." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What are you talking about, Tabitha? He has been siphoning money from your grandmother's inheritance trust since the day you turned 18, she whispered. "He used his position as the sole trustee to withdraw nearly $300,000 over the last 8 years to pay the interest on his failed real estate debts. He used your future to fund the very lifestyle he used to make you feel inferior. The records are all there, the tax filings, the unauthorized transfers, and the shadow ledgers he thought I had deleted." The final piece of the Tahoe audit had fallen into place. It was not just a matter of an excluded holiday or a fraudulent helicopter tour. My father had committed a systematic theft of my heritage. He had sought to erase me because my very existence was a reminder of the debt he owed me. I did not need a projector. I did not need to make a scene or shout to be heard. In the age of digital transparency, the most devastating strikes are delivered in silence. I opened my laptop on a small side table near the coats, tethering it to a secure encrypted hotspot I had established. I opened the Tahoe audit folder and uploaded the new files from Tabitha. I then opened a pre-drafted email that I had spent the afternoon refining. The recipient list was comprehensive, every business partner in the room, the Millers, the family's primary legal counsel, and the entire extended family group chat. The subject line was simple: Final Financial Disclosure and Transparency Report, the Preston Estate. I attached a secure, read-only link to the cloud folder. It contained the original Airbnb receipt for $18,500, the logs of the attempted identity theft, the audio recording of the confession in Greenwich, and the newly added evidence of the trust fund embezzlement. I looked across the room at Preston. He was currently laughing at a joke made by Mr. Miller, his hand resting patronizingly on the shoulder of a man whose career he was trying to manipulate. He looked like the king of a very small, very fragile mountain. I pressed the send button. A synchronized chorus of digital notifications began to ripple through the cabin. One by one, the phones in the pockets of the partners and the Millers began to chime. The sound was like a forest of digital cicadas, a relentless signal of a changing reality. Mr. Miller reached into his pocket and frowned at his screen. The other partners followed suit, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they began to scroll through the Tahoe audit. I watched as the color drained from my father's face. He realized in that moment that he was no longer the one telling the story. The room went silent, save for the sound of 20 people reading the truth about the man who was currently trying to borrow their money. I closed my laptop and tucked the flash drive into my pocket. I did not stay to watch the confrontation. I did not need to hear his excuses or my mother's pleas. I walked out of the cabin and into the cold, clean Tahoe night. The performance was over. The theater had burned to the ground, and for the first time in my life I was breathing air that was not clouded by their lies. The winter air in New York City is sharp and honest. It does not possess the artificial warmth of a Greenwich fireplace or the staged comfort of a borrowed cabin in Lake Tahoe. I sit on the terrace of my apartment watching the horizon where the sun begins to set, casting long purple shadows across the steel and glass of Manhattan. For the first time in my life, the silence around me does not feel like an exclusion. It feels like peace. The fallout from the Tahoe audit was swift and absolute. Within a month, the architecture of lies that Preston had built began to crumble under the weight of the evidence I had released. The Millers and the other partners did not just withdraw their support. They initiated their own legal inquiries into the financial discrepancies Preston had concealed. The bridge loan he had desperately sought evaporated overnight. Without the ability to leverage his reputation, the Greenwich estate was forced into a short sale to cover his mounting debts. The manicured lawns and the amber-lit hallways now belong to a family that hopefully understands that a house is not a home if it is built on a foundation of theft. Lucille has moved into a small apartment in a less prestigious town, her silence now permanent because she no longer has a social circle to perform for. The Le Creuset pots and the Lenox china were sold at auction, relics of a life that was never truly paid for. Caitlin's digital kingdom evaporated as well. When the truth of the toxic brother narrative reached her followers, the unfollows were a digital landslide. People do not like to find out that the aesthetic they admire was funded by siphoning money from a sibling's trust fund. I did not recover every dollar of the $300,000 that was stolen from my trust, nor did I care to. The $18,500 I spent on the chalet was a steep price to pay for a vacation I never had, but it was the most profitable investment of my life. It was the fee I paid to finally see my family for who they truly were. I have realized that true freedom is not found in the balance of a bank account or the recovery of stolen assets. True freedom is the right to walk away from a false narrative and stand in the light of your own reality. I no longer look at my worn stainless steel watch and feel inferior to a gold Rolex. My watch tracks time that belongs entirely to me. I have built a life in New York City that does not require a sponsor, a script, or a staged holiday card to feel significant. I am no longer the plus one in someone else's story. I am the author of my own. As the city lights begin to pulse below me, answering the darkness on their own terms, I feel a profound sense of belonging. I belong to the truth. I belong to the work I have done. I belong to myself. If you have ever felt like an outsider in your own family, leave a heart. You are not alone. How did this story resonate with you? Please share your reflections in the comments, as your feedback helps me create better content for you. Follow the channel to discover more meaningful and impactful stories. Your support is the foundation of everything I do. Thank you for being part of this.